There's a classic thought experiment that's designed to trick your brain into thinking long-term and getting out of the daily news cycle. And it goes like this. If a newspaper came out once a century, what would the front page banner headline be? Be defeated the Nazis, or landed on the moon, or built the internet? I would argue that it would be the story of a single number, maybe the most elemental measure of progress that we have: life expectancy at birth. The length of time that the average person can expect to live in a given place at a given time. 100 years ago, as best as we can measure, the average global life expectancy stood somewhere in the mid-30s. Today, it's just over 70. So in 1 century, we doubled global life expectancy. Now, to give a sense of what this looks like geographically, take a look at this image, these maps. This is data courtesy of the great organization Our World in Data. This is the world in 1950. And in blue are the countries where life expectancy is more than 70. You can see it's just 5 countries in Northern Europe. That's it. And in red, these are the countries where life expectancy is below 45. It's about a third of the planet. So fast forward to more recent history, 2015, in blue, the countries where life expectancy is above 70. Look at all that life. And in red, the countries where it's below 45. There's no red on the map because there are no countries where life expectancy is below 45. In fact, there are very few where it's below 60. This is an extraordinary achievement. And you'll sometimes hear people say that life expectancy and this kind of progress is actually just a statistical illusion, that we got better at reducing infant mortality, but the rest of our lives are actually not all that different. And it is true that infant mortality has been dramatically reduced over the last 100 years, but the story is much richer and more intense than that. If you take a look at this early infographic by the great Victorian statistician William Farr, which is attempting to show mortality rates by age group in London in the early 1840s. Now, I find something incredibly heroic about this chart. I mean, here's a guy without computers, without the internet, without Excel, trying to do something that is incredibly hard and incredibly important. He's trying to look at broad patterns in life and death in a great city, trying to make sense of what is going on. And what the chart reveals is that there is a tragic amount of death among children, not just infants, but 5-year-olds and 10-year-olds are dying at an alarming rate. But almost nobody makes it to 85 or 90. And more than half of the population is dead by the age of 45. How many people in this room are older than 45? Right? Think about that. Half of you would not be here. I mean, talk about optimism. That is the most fundamental form of good news there is. You are not dead, right? Now, I want to stress here that this good news is not uncomplicated. 100 years ago, there were less than 2 billion people on Earth. Today, there's almost 8 billion and counting. And we have that runaway population growth not because people started having more babies, but rather because people stopped dying and the generations stacked up. And we have problems like climate change because of these underlying trends as well. I mean, if we had kept mortality rates where they were in 1920, we wouldn't have anywhere near the magnitude of the climate crisis we're facing now because there simply wouldn't have been enough people on the planet to emit enough carbon into the atmosphere to make a meaningful difference. In a weird sense, climate change is the unintended consequence of industrialization and increased longevity. So all this extra life is a mixed blessing, like any change this momentous. But I want to stress not just that we did it, but I think the more interesting question is how we did it. That's what's been obsessing me over the last 3 or 4 years. That's the investigation I've been on, trying to figure out what are the prime movers when we see change this momentous. What is really driving that change? And I think we should say, given everything that's happening in the world, we should point out that, one of those prime movers, which we should shout from the rooftops, is vaccines, right? We doubled, yes, right? Thank you. I did invent vaccines, so I appreciate that. I mean, from smallpox to polio and to influenza and TB and measles and COVID. I mean, if we celebrated the eradication of smallpox the way we celebrate the moon landing, we would have a lot less vaccine hesitancy in the world right now. But I also think it's a mistake to focus exclusively on the march of science and the kind of tangible objects like vaccines and antibiotics or x-rays. And to explain what I mean by that, I think it's useful to look at the story of how we conquered one of the most terrifying threats of the 19th century. Milk. Now, we think of milk as this kind of emblem of health and vitality. But in fact, in the middle of the 19th century, milk was a serious health threat, particularly to children. We had no mechanical refrigeration, and so there was a lot of spoilage problems. People could get tuberculosis from milk. They figured out this thing for urban cattle where they couldn't feed them grass, so they would feed them slop from whiskey distilleries instead of grass. Brilliant idea. Which produced this kind of blue-tinted milk that was very dangerous called swill milk. In 1850, more than half of all the deaths recorded in New York City were young children, many of them killed by contaminated milk. Now look, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, I know how we solved this problem. We solved it with science. We solved it with chemistry, right? I mean, the solution is so famous, it's sitting there printed on every carton of milk in every grocery store in the country, right? Pasteurization. But actually, the story of pasteurization is a case study in the limits of science. Because Louis Pasteur came up with his technique for sterilizing milk in 1865. But we didn't actually have pasteurized milk as a standard on American grocery stores' shelves until 1915, a full 50 years later. And that's because science and chemistry on its own wasn't enough to make a meaningful change. You also needed persuasion. You had to convince people to drink pasteurized milk. You had to convince the dairy industry to make pasteurized milk. And that took a whole other cast of characters. It took muckraking journalists. It took crusading lawmakers. There was a whole subculture of pasteurization activists back then. Maybe the most unlikely one was a department store magnate named Nathan Strauss, who got obsessed with the pasteurization cause, and he funded all these milk depots all around New York City where pasteurized milk was sold at cost to low-income residents so that they would develop a taste for it.